Hello and welcome to Mann's Model Moments. In today's video I'm going to be giving you the top 8 essential tools for beginners in plastic scale modelling. Stay till the end of the video though, because I'll also talk a little bit about some of the money bait things that a lot of people say you should buy, but are really a luxury or optional purchase at the beginning, and you can avoid falling into those traps until you're sure that this is the hobby for you. For each of these I'm also going to tell you what I personally use and recommend, and giving you links to those products below. The first tool you'll need for scale modelling is a knife. It's simply one of the most useful and adaptable tools we have in our armoury. You can use a knife to cut a part from sprues, remove excess plastic from that part, scrape seam lines, position small parts, remove paint, scribe panel lines. It really is a jack of all trades. It might not do all of these jobs as well as other tools, but it can do all of them in one single, cheap, readily available and intuitively easy to use package. Now there are 1,000 different variations on a theme here, with most major model manufacturers having their own particular iteration, and many independent producers making their own too, companies like X-Acto for example. You can also find knife sets in hardware stores, supermarkets, bargain shops and elsewhere, and all of these will do at least part of the job. I personally, however, stand by my trusty Swad & Morton scalpel. Swad & Morton scalpels are available all over the world, they're standardised, they have many different blade designs should you need them, but for me the number 10A blade is a superb all-round winner. There are different handle designs as well, though I find the basic and simple number 3 handle works best for me in terms of ergonomics and durability. Side cutters are not strictly an essential, since you can cut parts off the sprue with your trusty knife, but if you're going to be doing any sort of long-term modelling, you'll need a pair of side cutters. They're also inexpensive enough and have other uses that I'd just go ahead and buy them right off the bat. You'll save yourself a whole bunch of time and also potential injury. Cheap precision side cutters are fine to start with, you can always spend more later on and relegate those cheap ones to DIY use in the future. The important thing is that they have nice flat blades on one side and usually are angled to be able to better access small parts on the sprue. After getting parts off the carrier sprue, you're going to need to stick them together, and for that we need plastic cement. For a beginner, any of the main manufacturer's standard cements are fine, Revell, Humbrol, Citadel, etc. One thing I would advise, however, if you're starting out, is get a precision applicator version. The reason I'd advise a precision applicator standard cement is that they give you a longer working time while still being good enough to work with small parts, and they're virtually impossible to spill. They're also cheap, ready available, so start there. Now some might advise Tamiya Thin or another liquid-based adhesive in a glass bottle, but if you're starting out I wouldn't recommend these. They have much shorter working times, they're very easy to spill despite the fact they've got a little built-in applicator brush. They're great to graduate into over time, but to start with, get the regular precision applicator, standard cement, and then work up from there. Most models don't go together 100% accurately, and you may be left with some gaps and seams to fill. Fortunately, there's a solution in the form of model filler. Now there's a ton of possibilities here too, but when you're starting out I'd advise you not to buy any of those, but to follow a decades old practice and to make your own. Take some of that cement you already have, some plastic shavings from your sprues, and mix them together. This forms a plastic sludge, affectionately known as sprue goo, which you can put into gaps to fill them. This has several advantages in that the dried material is the same plastic as your kit, so it will react the same way to sanding and can be cut in exactly the same way and will take paint in the same way as well. Abrasives are really a class of tools and can take many forms as well, but the reason I didn't break this down into just sandpaper or files or some other category is that it really doesn't matter which one you choose, it is your personal preference. At the end of the day, they are all doing the same thing, and whilst some will tackle some jobs better than others, their main functions can be done by pretty much any one of them. I'll mainly talk about sandpaper and sanding sticks here, with grits between 240 and 1000, and the main use of these abrasives is to remove marks, lines, seams, etc. formed in the construction of your model, so it looks good when you come to finish it. Again, there are a whole host of hobby-related products here, But I would just start out with some soft nail files. They're available in the same sort of grit range, usually 100, 180, 240, and then usually some polishing sticks around 800 to 1000. They're much cheaper and they do the same job. This is really where a lot of the sanding sticks came from. Making a model is of course only one half of our hobby. Finishing it to look how you want it to is the other, and that mainly comes in the form of painting. You can pick up some reasonable quality synthetic brushes almost anywhere, from art stores through hobby shops to Amazon, but there's no need to go mad here. Get a reasonable size 0 or 1 brush for detail painting, and then a larger brush, maybe a 4 or a 6 depending on the size of the model if you're intending to brush paint it. So of course you'll also need some paints, and here I'd recommend acrylics. They're water soluble, they're non-toxic, they're easy to use. They're also available in a massive diversity from a massive number of manufacturers, although personally I'd recommend Vallejo, as they're excellent paints, they've got good pigment density, they're reasonably priced, and they come in a lot of specific colours for military and aviation hobbyists. The alternative as a beginner is to use spray cans. Why spray cans? Well, firstly you're just starting out and spray cans are disposable, they give a very even finish, and you're probably only looking at 2 to 3 cans for your first project. And depending on what you're modelling, even if you do carry on, you may never use specific paint colours ever again. So it's not really going to be considered a waste if you buy those compared to buying normal paints. Here I'd recommend Tamiya. They do a good range and Tamiya are very good quality paints. Whichever way you decide, however, just buy the paints you need for your first build as a beginner. Remember, you may not actually feel that this is the hobby for you and you don't want to spend a whole lot of money on paints that you don't need. Masking materials are not strictly speaking essential unless you're using spray cans or airbrushing, in which case they pretty much are. But masking materials are also generally super helpful and they don't have to be expensive. Tamiya tape is the go-to here for sharp edges. Please don't use cheap masking tape used for DIY. Whatever you do, you will ruin your models. But household items like blue tack, paper, foil, cling film all work really well here. In terms of the Tamiya tape, I'll start off with the 10mm. It's available in either dispenser form or as a refill, and it will do most of the jobs that you need in your first project. At the beginning of the video I said I would give you some pitfalls to avoid, and the first one of these is the airbrush. Don't buy an airbrush. So many people recommend this and it's absolutely not something you should do when you're just starting out. Now, don't get me wrong, airbrushes are fantastic. I use mine almost exclusively for the majority of my painting, but there is a learning curve to it, and it's not a cheap entry point. The compressor just being one of the biggest associated costs in addition to the airbrush itself, but there's also a whole host of other things to consider with regards to airbrushing, safety, mess, and so on. So just don't. I'd say it's one of the first things you want to consider when you're developing and expanding into the hobby, but it's not for the beginner. Of course, if you already have an airbrush that you're using for other things, then you'll leapfrog a whole part of the development of the hobby anyway. But for somebody just stepping into the hobby and unfamiliar with airbrushing, it's a big and important step to take later on down the line. The other big pitfall to avoid is one that we're all guilty of. Don't buy tons of seemingly fancy and useful things that you don't actually need. Yes, there are a ton of things that you can buy for our hobby, but many of them you will use rarely or never. They're very specialised. Case in point for myself are needle files. I thought they would be very useful when I started out and I bought a couple of sets. I've hardly used them in 30 years. Save your money to spend on kits and paint in the first instance, and you can expand later. I'm going to have a hobby expansion video in the future, so make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell so that you can see those when you progress along the path more when you're ready. So to summarise, the top 8 beginner's essential tools you'll need to get into scale plastic modelling are a knife. I use a Swan & Morton No. 3 handle with No. 10A blades. Side cutters. Cheap precision side cutters are fine for your first project. You'll use them later anyway, so get a pair of those. Model cement. something like Revell Contactor Precision Applicator Cement. It's cheap, it's ubiquitous, it's useful beyond your first project. Filler. Make some sprue goo once you've got your model cement. It's really easy. Abrasives. Use soft nail files. They're cheap, readily available from Amazon, drugstores, wherever. Brushes. Get yourself a 0, a 1, 2, 0, 6 and an 8 if you're brush painting. Just synthetic brushes, you can find those most places. Paints. Go for acrylics. Vallejo offer a fantastic selection. If you're wanting to try out spray cans, Tamiya is your go-to. And then masking materials. Tamiya tape 10mm, get some of that, but otherwise you can use blue tack, foil, paper, cling film, other stuff you have around the home. And remember, avoid those pitfalls. Don't buy an airbrush. If there's one thing I want you to take away as a beginner in this hobby is that you don't need it to start with. And the other thing is, just don't buy all the fancy tools and spend a fortune on stuff that you may never ever use. I'll put links to all of those products that I've mentioned here in the video description below, so check them out, get the tools you need to take those first steps into the scale hobby world. And I'm also going to be covering what kit you should consider for your first experience, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notified when that comes out. That's all for this instalment of Mann's Model Moments. Please like, subscribe and share this video if you enjoyed it. It's the best way of helping me to grow the channel and produce more content like it. With that, I hope you have plenty of modelling moments of your own, and I look forward to welcoming you on the next video.